My basic shift dress with optional waist shaping is quick to sew and easy to fit. So here is the full length of my dress, and this is the back. It's exactly the same kind of shape on the back. It's got a high neck too. I'll show you how to make the pattern in this tutorial. I'll show you everything you need to know to do that, and also everything you need to know to sew it up, including pattern matching the zip at the centre back and finishing off the neck and the armholes with a lovely clean finish. If you're new to my channel, I'm Ali and I've been dressmaking for over 30 years. I make all my own clothes and I also make dresses for clients. I make the pattern for this dress from a fitted bodice block. You could also make it from a semi-fitted bodice block if you want it less fitted. My dress has got some small waist darts. You don't need to put these in. A traditional shift dress doesn't have waist shaping, but if you have a body shape like me that's a little bit more hourglass, I just find it a little bit more flattering having that waist shaping. So that's completely optional. So I'll show you how to make this pattern from the bodice block. If you don't have one already, then there is a link in the description below to both my fitted and my semi-fitted bodice blocks. I will show you how to make this pattern from that. You need to just move the darts. I have a side dart here rather than going into the shoulder, which is what's on the block. And then also how to continue it for the skirt part of the dress from the waist down. Along with the link to the blocks for this, I've also included links for sewing darts, doing zips, 2 different kinds of zips, and bagging out the neck and the armholes. I cover this in this tutorial, but if you want something a little bit more in depth, then these links will be helpful for you. So once I have made the pattern, I make a sample before cutting into this fabric, and I always recommend doing that so you can make sure that your dress fits absolutely perfectly. So I'll show you how to put the sample together, and then I'll show you how I fit my sample and how I then amended it, and I'll just talk about various adjustments that you might need to do. But if your bodice block fits before you start making the pattern for this, the adjustments that you need to do at sample stage should be minimal. It's just one of those things that's always good to do, to just double check it fits before you finish off your pattern, adding the seam allowances and everything, and before you cut out your lovely fabric. So once I've fitted the sample, I'll show you what to cut out. This has a facing, it's not fully lined. You could do a lining if you prefer to, and I will show you everything you need to know how to sew it up. I'll show you what order to do it in and every little detail that you need to know. So before you start with the pattern, there's a few measurements that you need to think about. You need to just think about how low you want this going at the front. So if you've got a bodice block, it's gonna go right up to the neck. So just think about this distance and how far you want to drop that neck down, and the same on the back. And think about how wide you want your shoulders, how thick you want your straps, all those kind of details. And you might also want to drop the armhole down a little bit, just because it makes it more comfortable. On a bodice block, the armhole is where the seam would be if you were having sleeves. So you might want to just open it up a little bit. And if you want to, you can actually bring these straps in quite a bit and have a more cut out shape. That's just down to your design preference. You can have whatever shape you want. You could also do this with a V. You can do all kinds of amendments on this pattern for however you want it. It doesn't need to look exactly how my dress does. And then also, the bodice block only goes as far as the waist. I'll show you how to draw the skirting. So just think about how long you want it and then how wide you want the hem. I would recommend just finding something that you have that is similar, that you like, and just measuring across the hem. Or of course, if you want this just going straight down, you don't need to widen it at all. You can just do it for the width of your hip plus whatever ease you are having, and just continue it straight down. And then that's the other measurement, is when you are drawing the hip onto this, you need to measure your hips and then add enough ease on so that your dress isn't tight here. You'll see when I make my pattern that I was a little bit optimistic about the size of my bottom, and mine did come out a little bit too tight, so I did have to adjust the pattern. But I will show you how I did all of that when I come to fit the sample. So I've traced round my bodice block to get started. So this is my centre back line over here, this is my centre front, and then I've drawn on where the waist is, and then I've positioned these accordingly to the centre front, centre back and the waistline, and then the bottom of my paper is the exact length I want my dress. And then the distance between the centre back and the centre front line is the width of my hem. So basically a dress laid on the table, measured across the hem, folded flat, that's the total. And it means that when I come to draw in the shape of the side of my skirt, I don't have to add any extra in. It's already exactly the right size. I've turned it this way so we can have a closer look. So the things you need to think about if you're having any waist shaping is how to shape it on the front and the back. So a traditional shift doesn't have waist shaping, but if you're anything like me, having no shaping at the waist just feels really unflattering. So I'm gonna put some quite subtle darts in. I'm not gonna have it as shaped as my fitted bodice block, but I'm still gonna have some shape so I don't feel like I am just wearing something that literally goes straight down from the bust, because for my body shape, it's not flattering, and I know a lot of people will be the same. If you do have a more straight up and down shape and you don't want the waist shaping, then you can literally just ignore all the bits about these waist darts. So the thing that's a bit of a pain, if you're quite curvy, your dart on your front is likely to be bigger than your back on the bodice. But on a skirt, it would be the other way around. And if I just move that up, if you are now having a skirt here, you're likely to have a smaller dart on the front and a bigger one on the back, just because of the obvious ways that our body shapes are. But if you're cutting this all in one piece, you need to find a way of balancing that out so that it's shaped perfectly front and back. And the compromise is to just have these more similar in size, and you'll have it a little bit bigger on the skirt part than what you normally would on a skirt on the front, and vice versa. On the back, your dart on the skirt part is going to be a little bit smaller than if you were making a fitted skirt. But this dress isn't designed to be super fitted, and that's why it doesn't matter so much. If you want the same shape dress but much more fitted, I would suggest having a waist seam, and I do have another tutorial on a similar shape dress with a seam at the waist. But this isn't designed to be super fitted, so I will show you now how to do that waist shaping and then how to do your skirt shape to get a really nice fitted shift dress. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in my side seam. So I've put this mark here, and it's literally the halfway point between the centre front and the centre back. You don't need to draw a line like that, but I wanted to make sure you could see it. So this part here is the very bottom of the side seam, and it just needs to join up with the waist on both sides, but we obviously also need to think about the hip. You couldn't just do a straight line because it would be way too tight on the hip, so you need to think about that as well. So looking at it this way, as it's going to make a lot more sense. This is the front. Let's just label it, as it's not so obvious now. You can't see the top. This is the side seam here on the waist, and it needs to go down to this point on the hem, but you need to think about where the hip is. So you need to mark a line where your hip line is. That just coincidentally lines up with the dot and cross. So for me, I've measured that 25 centimetres below my waist seam. Everyone's is going to be slightly different, but that's where the fullest part of my hip is. So what I need to do now is I've got my hip line 25 centimetres down from my waist where the fullest part is, and then I've measured how big I want the hip part of the dress to be. So basically my hip measurement plus plenty of ease, and then I've divided that by 4. So that gives me 29.5 centimetres, which I'm measuring exactly the same from the centre front and centre back across here. And this gives me the side seam at the hip point, and I'm just going to draw a straight line from that to where the point is on the hem that I've already drawn. So that's the bottom bit of the side seam. So I've basically got my side seam now on the bodice part here. I'm missing the bit for the hip, and I've got this little bit at the bottom. So you might see a little bit of a mess here, and that is because I've already drawn my hip in and it didn't quite go to plan. I sometimes mess my words up while I'm recording, and I have to redo it because I can't put out a video where I make a complete mess of the words. So let's just draw this in again. So before I start doing this hip, I need to add a little bit of ease at the waist. I'm not going to add loads, but I don't want it super tight. So I'm adding 1/4 centimetre at the waist point on my sides, and now I just need to draw my hip curve in. So I can't do this as a straight line because it's not going to look great, but if I just draw that for now, what you basically need to do is just curve this out a little bit. So I'm just doing this by eye. Everybody's curve is going to be slightly different, which is why I don't really want to give you a measurement, because it depends how wide you're having the hem, it depends how big your hip is, and it depends on the size of your waist. And I haven't drawn a very good curve there, so I'm just going to redraw that in. And it is just important to get that nice and smooth. So now I can rub out the previous straight line, and I've got my hip shaping there. So that now looks like a good hip shape. I've got my little bit of ease on the waist. I need to do exactly the same with the front, and you'll see that it's going to be a slightly different shape because obviously my bodice is slightly different on the front to the back, but my hip is exactly the same on the front and the back. So it just means this is going to be slightly different. It doesn't mean that everybody's will be, but you'll see that this is just slightly steeper than this. So just going to do exactly the same, and I don't need to curve it out quite as much on the front. In fact, that might be a little bit too much. It's only the smallest amount. So I'll just play around with this curve and then show you once I've done it. And you can see now I've got my hip in. It looks pretty much straight, but it's not. If I put this ruler here, you can see that it's not straight to the ruler, but it's just a very subtle curve. But what it has done is given me this slightly odd shape here, which I'm not so happy about. So all I'm going to do is going to make a compromise. I'm going to bring it out a little bit here, and I'm going to bring it in a little bit at the bottom. So I don't want to take too much out of the hem. So I'm going to just draw that little line there, and then I'm going to bring it up here to join this point of the curve, and it will just bring it out very slightly there. I'm just going to rub those out a bit first, and that's where I'm going to draw my seam in there. So just looking at it again, we've now got the skirt part done, other than just these darts, but we're going to play around with the darts on the top in a second, and then we will finish them off into the skirt part. So I'll flip it around and we can finish off the bodice part of the dress. There's not an awful lot to do on this. The first thing I'm going to do is add my ease all the way up here. So I've added 1/4 centimetre at the waist. I'm going to do exactly the same up here as well. So I'm just rubbing that out first, because it's going to be quite hard to rub it out once I've drawn the new line in because they're so close together. And then I'm just marking 1/4 centimetre from where that point is there. And I can just now draw in that new side seam position. And now that I've done that, this bit here, which has made quite an angle, I just want to smooth that out a little bit. So I'm just going to rub a little section of it out at the waist, and it's not going to change the fit. We're literally talking a few millimeters, but it just takes that point off if I just draw that in with more of a curve. So that is the ease added in there. And as I said before, I want to play around with these waist darts. So if I just move this up here a little bit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit out of this front dart because it's quite a big dart for quite a bit of shaping on the bust, and I don't want it as fitted as that. So I'm going to take 4 millimeters off of either side of that. A lot of what you do with these darts really comes down to your body shape and how you want to play around with them. If you don't have much waist shaping anyway, you might want to just completely eliminate the front dart and just have a small back dart. It really does depend what shape you are. So I'm just redrawing that in. So I've basically added quite a bit of ease in on my waist by doing that. And that's why I didn't add too much in when I changed the shape here, because I knew I was going to add a fair bit in here. I've changed it by 4 millimeters either side. So it means over the whole front, I've added 16 millimeters in, or 1.5 centimeters, which is quite a bit. So this dart is now much more similar to the back, and I just need to extend those darts into the skirt. So if I show you on the front, and then you can just do exactly the same on the back. So I just need the center point, which coincidentally lines up with my dot and crosses. And basically the length of it, it depends how wide it is as to how long you want it. You want it kind of around, I tend to do this by eye, but 11 centimeters is quite a good length for a front dart there. If your dart's a little bit wider, you might want to go slightly longer. And if your dart is narrower, you could get away with it being slightly shorter. But that's the kind of shape you want it to be. You don't want it to go too far down towards the hip, but if it's too short, then it's going to be quite an abrupt finish. And then exactly the same on the back here. I'm just finding the halfway point, which doesn't line up with my dot and cross this time. and I've just extended that down there, and on the back I am gonna just do that exactly the same length for now, and then when I put my sample on I can really play around with these darts and decide what I want to do with them. Because you've got the very different shaping on the bodice front to back if you're quite curvy, it does dictate these darts here, which are kind of the opposite of what you'd have on a skirt if you're quite curvy, if you were doing a separate skirt block. So that's the bit where you need to play around with the balance of it. You can also play around with your side seam as well, and you really do need to fit this on to get it perfect to your body shape. If you are less curvy, you don't necessarily need these darts at all. I'd suggest maybe a very skinny dart on the back and possibly none on the front at all, and then just play around with the side seam. So every body shape being completely different is why I always say, for this style of dress, make a sample, fit it on, and then see how it looks. So that is the basic fit of the dress. All we need to do now is the armhole shaping, the neck shaping, and I'm going to move this dart from here, which is not a particularly lovely design to have it go up into the shoulder. I'm going to move it to a side dart over here. So I'm going to do that before I do anything else. And I always like my darts, it needs to go from the bust point here, and I always like them to go down very slightly. You could draw your dart going down quite a bit. If you're not having a dart here, then it's actually quite nice. It's also called a French dart, to go at quite an angle, but because I've got this one here, I'm just going to angle mine very slightly, and I'm going to draw it there. So that is going to be the new position of my dart, and I now need to close this one up and open up this one before I can finish the rest off. So that I can play around with that dart, I've just literally cut up the side. Obviously make sure you cut it in the right place at the bottom, and I'm just going to put the back aside for now while I play around with the dart on the front, and then we can put them back together to do the armholes and the neck. So if you've not moved a dart before, you'll see now just how easy it is. So apologies for the rustling sound of the paper, there's not much I can do about that. So all I'm doing is I'm cutting down this new position here, right to where that bust point is. And then with this dart here, doesn't really matter which side you cut down, but I'm going to go down this side here, and again all the way to that bust point, and you just want to leave this bit of paper attached by the tiniest little bit. If you accidentally take it off, it doesn't matter, but try and keep it attached, and then you're just literally swinging it round. So if you were sewing that dart up, you would in effect be meeting those two lines there. So we're just lining that up there, and it opens it up here, and that's your new side dart. So let's turn it the right way up so you can see a bit better. So I just need to stick that down now, and if you end up with lots of tape and lots of cuts on your patterns, you can always trace it off. So I'm not putting loads on because I'm going to be drawing my neck, and I don't want loads of tape in the way. So as long as there's enough to hold it together is fine. And then I'm just putting a bit of paper behind here now, and I'm not gonna put too much there because I'm going to be drawing my actual dart position in a second, and I'm actually going to stick this together the other side of that side seam, because what I'm going to do before I do anything with the neck is I'll finish this dart off. And when you are doing darts on something like this, you don't want to sew them all the way to the bust point. So you want to bring them back a little bit, and for this I'm going to do it to here. That's about 2 centimetres or 2.2 centimetres, but I generally just do it by eye, and that's why I didn't want loads of tape on here because I wouldn't be able to draw it. And exactly the same here, and that is where I need to redraw my darts to. So you don't want to be pressing as hard as what I am. I'm doing this so that you can see it, but in reality I would be drawing much lighter, because when you're constantly rubbing out these lines, it's a lot easier if you've not pressed very hard. So all I'm doing now is just redrawing that dart in now with these new positions. And then on here as well, obviously I've got a cut line, there's not anything to rub out, but I am just lining it up with the original edge here and redrawing it to where that bust point is there. Hopefully you can see that nice and clearly. And now that that's all drawn in, I can put more tape on here to hold that in place perfectly. The last thing I need to do is finish off my side seam here, and all I need to do is continue that line down there, and then I find the halfway point, which is here, and then I draw that into there. And that means that when I sew my dart up and fold it towards the bottom, it'll all line up perfectly against this side seam. So that is the darts now done. I'm not doing anything with my back dart. I can now finish off all of these bits. So I'm not adding a seam allowance to this pattern. I'm gonna make my sample with it without a seam allowance, and then I'm gonna trace it off once I know it's perfect. So I don't need to worry about drawing anything on here for now. So what I'm gonna do to get the neck perfect, I'm going to just cut this off at the shoulder. And you can see there's quite a bit of paper behind where my darts are. So I'm just gonna trim some of that off as well, so there's not too much overlap. And as I've got a lot going on here, I might as well also just cut down my side seam, because then I can get all of this excess paper trimmed off. So I'm going to work on the front first. And for this dress, I'm not cutting my neck out loads. If you were going really low or really wide, you might need to adjust the neck in case it gapes. But for the amount that I'm taking out of this, then I shouldn't really need to do any kind of adjustment. So I've already had a little look in the mirror of how I want to adjust this. And I'm only bringing my front neck down by 4 centimetres. And I've had a look at how I want my strap. And I don't want it to go too wide. So I'm bringing it in by 0.5 centimetre on that side. And I am making it 5 centimetres wide in total. And the reason I didn't put too much tape here is because I want to join this nice and easily without any tape in the way that's going to prevent me from drawing. So all I'm going to do now is draw this by eye. I want to keep it fairly straight right in the middle there because I don't want it going down to a V. It's very easy to accidentally draw your curve going to a point and it ends up looking like a V. And that now meets up with that point there, and then I'll see when I join it onto the back how that shape is there. All I'm looking at now is that that looks a little bit straight, so I'm just going to scoop that out a little bit more. You can use special curved rulers if you want, but doing this by eye is absolutely fine. So I can just rub the previous line out now, and now I can stick that together, and that's my front neck now done. And then for my armhole, I want to lower this a little bit. I'm not going to come down much. I can always bring it down a bit more when I make the sample, but I'm just bringing that down by 0.5 centimetre. And I'm going to just cut this out a little bit around here because this is obviously where a seam would be if you were adding a sleeve. And I don't want it to be quite as tight as that. And I need to just join that line up with my new position at the top. And that's how it now looks. I'm going to be cutting this off in a second, so I'm not going to bother rubbing that out. But that's now my new armhole position. So I just need to now line this up with my back. So I need to bring this down exactly the same amount on the back as what I have on the front. So it obviously all matches up. And exactly the same on my shoulder part here. And my strap width is 5 centimetres. So once I draw my neck in, I'll have a little look and see how this dart sits. So what I need to do is line this up here, and I want my armhole shape just to continue round. I don't want it suddenly going to a point at the shoulder. So I'm just doing exactly the same as I did on the front and just shaving a little bit off because I just don't want a really tight armhole. It's totally up to you how tight you want your armhole to be. You could actually have it cut out quite a bit. You could have your strap much closer to your neck. It's just down to what style you want. And then for my neck, I just want this to continue around. So I'm going to ignore that dart for a second, and I'm just going to draw the shape in how I think it would look good. I don't want to come as low down at the back. I'm going to keep that fairly straight. That probably looks a little bit too straight. So I'm just going to bring it down a little bit just to make it a better shape. Let's just rub that out. Made a bit of a mess of that. And that looks a much better shape. So now I just need to decide what I'm going to do about this back dart. So what I don't want to do is completely ignore that dart because obviously I need some shaping there. It's not exactly the same as the front, but I do need some kind of shaping because my shoulders at the back aren't completely flat. So I'm just going to rub that dart out. And I don't need to do a dart as big, but what I'm going to do is I don't want my dart coming down here. I don't want a dart here. It's just not going to look great. I want this to be completely simple at the back. All I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line from where my armhole edge is here over to the neck, and I'm just going to do a little bit of an overlap just to stop my neck from gaping. What I don't want to do is overlap it too much because it's going to really affect the shape of the armhole. So I'm just overlapping that a little bit there. That's just moved. It's about 4 millimeters. And it will just get rid of a little bit of gape that potentially could appear in my back neck. And you see it hasn't really affected this shape. It doesn't really look much different, but it's just done the job of a little bit of a dart going into there. If you're having a strap that's much wider, then I would keep a dart on and just make sure it's centered on the strap. So you can just move your dart from your block over accordingly. So that is the back now done. There's no dart on it. I've just not been able to rub it out very well because I've pressed so hard so that you could see it. So I can get all of this now cut out. So before I cut all of this out, let's just have a look at what we've got. So the waist position we started with, the centre back and the centre front we started with. We've now got a hip line and drawn that in. We've drawn the side seam in. Obviously I've cut this one out, not this. I just need to cut this out exactly the same. I need to cut the centre front and the centre back. And then for the armholes, it's just this inner line here that I'm going with, so I need to cut around there. And the same with the neck, it's the opening here that I need to cut out. And that really is it. That is the entire pattern. It's lovely and simple. So I just wanted to quickly show it now it's all cut out so you can see exactly what's what. So I am going to make a sample now before I get on and make my dress. This is the kind of pattern that when I make it, I want it to be absolutely perfect because I know I'm going to be making this again and again. It's the kind of thing that I keep, and every time I see a lovely fabric that I can't resist, I know I can put the dress together really quickly if I've got this perfect pattern. So I'm going to make a sample, get this absolutely perfect, and then I'll trace the whole thing off and add my seam allowances, making it really quick to cut out. So I'll get this cut out and I'll show you exactly what seam allowances I've added just for the sample. So that's everything cut out for the sample. So basically I've put a seam allowance where the seams are, and that is just basically on the side and the centre back where I'm going to pin it on. And then at the bottom, I've not put any kind of hem on. And then on the neck and the armholes, I've not put anything. I've literally cut it where the pattern is so that when I try it on, I can see exactly how it fits, exactly where the neck is, all of that. And then what I'm going to do, all around the top here, I'm going to stay stitch it, because what I don't want to do is fit it and then as I'm putting it on, where this edge is cut, have it slightly stretched because I won't know if it fits perfectly. So I'm just going to stay stitch all of this before I sew it up. So basically all I need to do is just sew up my few darts and then sew it together on the sides. On the centre back, I'm just going to sew it up to the point where I'm going to be pinning it on. And then I just need to sew my shoulders together. So once I've done that, I can get this on and see how it fits, and then any little details that I want to change I can do before I trace this off to have it as a complete pattern. So this is my sample, and what I should have said was if you have trouble pinning behind yourself, because it's obviously pinned at the back, then just leave an opening at the side, or you could even have your opening at the front instead, because you need to make sure you've got it pinned on properly. But if you can't get your arms behind your back like that, or you don't have someone else maybe to do it, then just put your opening somewhere else. So as I said at the beginning, I was a little bit optimistic on my hip size. So what I have already done is I actually unpicked this seam and I re-sewed it a little bit with a little bit less seam allowance than what I had, because it was just too tight around here. It fit, but it was too snug, and this dress isn't meant to be super tight. I wanted it just to have a bit of space. So I'll show you in a second this laying down on the table, and I'll show you where I let this out and then how to adjust the pattern. So that's number one, is just check you're happy with the total width. So it fit absolutely fine here. It was just a bit tight here, so I've just adjusted that. So I'll show you that in a second, and then you'll see I've put some pins here as well. I said when I made the neck opening that you sometimes need to do a little overlap to get rid of any gaping, and I thought I'll try it without doing that overlap, but it did turn out to be a little bit gapey. So you can see here I've just pinned it in to get rid of that gaping, and I will show you how to adjust that. I haven't had to do it on the armhole, but if you do need to do that, hopefully you shouldn't have to, because if your bodice block already fits, unless you're cutting out this armhole quite a bit, then they should fit perfectly. But if they don't, I'll show you how to do that as well. And then obviously check your back neck as well. So I'll show you how to do those adjustments. And then I don't know how well you can see it, but there's a line drawn on here where the dart is. And what it is when the bodice is fitted at the waist, so the bodice block is fitted nice and snug at the waist, it holds it all in place. But as soon as you go a little bit looser, I've not got a huge amount of waist shaping here, it can just ride up a little bit. And although it's still kind of in the right place, I feel like the darts just feel a little bit high. So all I'm doing is lowering that, so that with this more roomy dress that can ride up, it's not going to appear too high. You don't want to drop it too much. And what you might want to do is just have a look at the angle as well. And I'll show you exactly how I do that. It's a really minor adjustment. And also just check you're happy with how long the darts are. They'll be in the right position because you'll already have them in the right position on your bodice block, but just check you're happy with how long they are and how high up they come. And obviously if you're not doing any waist shaping on this, then you don't need to worry about that at all. And then obviously just check that you're happy with the armhole shaping. If you feel like it's too tight, you can open it up a little bit. If you feel like you've lowered it too much or opened it up too much across here, then just change that. And then with the neck, it is just down to what design you want. You need to just check that you're happy with the width of the straps and where the neck sits according to those. And if you want your neck to be a little bit more closed in or a little bit more open or a slightly different shape, then you can literally just draw on the new shape of the neck. Just bear in mind, if you are opening it up any more than how open it already is, you might need to do an extra little adjustment for gaping. The more you cut it out, the more it's going to gape without that adjustment. But you'll see exactly what I do with this. And if you are changing the neck quite dramatically, then maybe just make another sample, or just cut your sample and then pin it on yourself and see how it looks. And then obviously just check that you're happy with the length. I don't think this is quite on screen, but mine sits just above the knee. Check you're happy with that length, and check you're happy with the width of the skirt of your dress. That is a nice basic thing to amend if you want it longer or shorter, or just bringing the hem in or out a little bit. But the great thing about doing the sample like this is now I can trace off my pattern, I can add all the seam allowances on, so it's going to be super quick to now cut out every time I make a dress, and I'm going to know that it fits absolutely perfectly. First thing I'm going to do is just show you how to do these amendments and just show you a little bit closer up exactly what I've done, what I've pinned, what I've drawn on. Then I'll show you how to add the seam allowances, what to add where, how much to add on for the hem, and then also how to draw the pattern for the facing. So you can either do a facing like I'm going to on mine, or you can do a full lining, which means you'll just basically be duplicating your outer, exactly the same with your lining fabric. So I'll show you exactly how to do that, and then how to change your seam allowances on the armholes to make sure your facing or your lining sits perfectly underneath, so you don't see any of it poking through. So let's get on now with finishing off this pattern, doing all the amendments and getting it ready to use with my lovely fabric. So let's have a look at those changes now, and they're all changes that are going to be quite common. So the first thing was, obviously, I was a little bit optimistic about the size of my bottom, so I let the whole thing out. So I didn't change it at this point here, and I don't know how well you can see, but at this point here is where I started letting it out, and it wasn't a huge amount. So there's little pencil marks here where the original seam was. So I've literally just let it out. It's probably about 6mm either side. It's about 7mm either side. So that's basically what I need to add on from about this point here all the way to the hem, and then I'll just ease it back into the original seam up here. And I could get away with it that little bit tighter, but actually I don't want this as a tight dress, and shift dresses generally aren't that tight. So I'm gonna let that out. So any adjustments you need to do to your side seam, you'll see in a second what I do. And then on the neck, and I did say this when I was making the pattern, that I might not get any gaping because I was only cutting out a little bit, but you can see from this that it's amazing, even just going down a few centimetres and changing those shoulders a little bit, how gapey it was. So this is the amount it needs to come in, and you can see when you look at it this way, it's not actually that much, but it just shows how much difference it makes. So I'll show you in a minute how to do that. And again, that is quite a common thing to do. And if you have the same thing going on your armhole, then the process of changing that and taking out any gaping is exactly the same as what I do for the neck. I'll explain that when I do the neck, how to do the armhole. And then the other thing is the dart. So I was happy with my darts coming down here front and back, but my dart here, and this quite often happens, is if you're not having anything that pulls it in at the waist, then it's naturally just going to go up a little bit. You can keep pulling it down to get that dart and that bust point in the right position, but it's going to just naturally rise. And we're only talking a little bit. I'm just dropping it. It's literally, I'd say about 7mm. Yeah, 7mm. I'm dropping it down, and I'm not going to have it go quite as far along. So that's the original end of my dart, and I'm just making it slightly shorter. And then I'm just going to change the angle a little bit because I felt like it was a little bit straight across. I'm really not changing it by much at all. I'm moving it down 7mm at that end, and this end is 12mm. So that's all the adjustments I need to do. The other things I would definitely check are the length, the general kind of fullness of your skirt, and then obviously all of these things on the front. Just check on the back as well. Check you are happy with how you've done your neck, how far down it goes. Check you're happy with the width of the straps, just all those little details. So what I'll do now is I'll just go through those one at a time, amending those on my pattern. I'll do all these adjustments in red so you can really clearly see what I'm doing. So in terms of changing the width on this side seam, I'm going to trace it off in a second. If I was making it smaller, then I would trim it off this to trace it off, but as I'm making it a little bit bigger, all I'm going to do is mark the point where I kept it the same, which is here, and then the first bit where I can see that I've let it out to the maximum amount, which is here. So I need to let all of this out here by 7mm. And then in this bit here, I need to kind of blend it into the original seam. So when I trace it off, I'll do that. And then if I look now at the dart, so I've made it very slightly shorter. So hopefully you can see what I'm doing here. Let's zoom in a little bit. So that's where the length of the dart went to, and I'm just making it very slightly shorter to here. And then I'm lowering it on this side by 12mm and up here by 6.5mm. So all I need to do is draw in that new position. And I'm not going to cut this and kind of swivel bits around because it's only a minor change really. So I'm just going to draw 12mm down from that side as well, because both sides of the dart need to move down. And I'm going to join that to there. And then I'll just make sure that they are still the same length. So I've got 14.3 on the top and 14.2 on the bottom. So all I'll do when I trace this off is I'm just going to add 1mm. It's a tiny amount, but you need to make sure it all matches up. I'm just going to add that onto this side so it still matches. But you'll see what I do in a second when I trace that off. And then the last thing is just to take the gaping out of the neck, which I thought I might not need to do, but it's always good to do a sample and check. And it's just as well, because I'd hate to make this dress and then have this gaping here. So the measurement across the top here is 5mm, and that was 4mm. So we'll go with 4.5mm. So that is obviously folded. So it's double that. So double 4.5mm is 9. So I'm going to use this line here, and I'm going to do a mark there that is 9mm over. So all I'm going to do is just cut back down this line. I tried separating it, but I think it was stuck together too well, so I wasn't able to do it. And I'm going to just cut in the middle of that dart there. And I'm going to have to continue that to the bust point here. So I've had to cut it around a slight curve because I moved that bust point down very slightly. So I'm just overlapping that. So basically where I've cut it meets this point 9mm over. So what I'm doing is I'm getting rid of that extra fabric there where it's gaping. So all I need to do is just turn that back into a curve. I don't want this jutting out here. I liked the position of that. So all I'm going to do is just reshape that so it all lines up. So that little bit there needs to come off. And I need to just make sure when I trace this dart off that I do it correctly. So it's made my dart slightly bigger because I've taken it out of there. It has to move somewhere. So it's not changing the fit of this bit here. It's just putting extra into that dart there, which helps take it out of this bit. So these are my positions here. So let's make sure I get this absolutely perfect when I trace it off. I'm following this line here, and I need to come out 1 millimeter here. And this is my bust point here. It can get a little bit confusing when you end up with lots and lots of lines, which is why I've done this in red. And if you're tracing it off, then I would recommend doing it in a different colour so you can see exactly what's what, so you don't get confused with which lines are which. The other thing I didn't mention was the size of the armhole. Just check you're happy with where this sits and whether you want to fill it in a little bit more if it's gapey, or if you want to cut it out a bit more if it's too tight. So I'm just going to cut that little bit off there. Anything that needs cutting off, I cut off, and anything that needs adding on, I just write on my pattern with little arrows and stuff like that. So that's everything I need to do. If your armhole's gapey, it's exactly the same principle as what I've just done on the neck. So all I would do in that case is, if I just do this in green, I would just cut a line like this, and if it's gapey, you can overlap it exactly the same as I did this and open that dart up accordingly. But I don't need to do any of that, and I don't need any adjustments on my back other than just exactly the same as my side here, which is just letting out this seam. So if I line up the waist there, I can just draw these arrows in exactly the same places to know where to add the fullness in on my side seam. And one thing I didn't mention before, because I wanted to check all of the fit first, is that if I line this hip point up here and I follow that seam, they are very, very slightly different in length because it's more rounded on this side than this side. And what I'm going to do is, because it's a tiny amount over the whole amount, is I'm just easing this onto here. It's on a slight curve, so it's going to ease on really well. If you've got quite a bit of difference, then you might want to, on the bigger side, just take a little bit off, and on the smaller side add a little bit on, just to have less easing. But because mine is only that little bit, you can see there with it lined up that they've just misaligned very slightly. All it means is I need, when I sew it together, to ease this little bit on, and it's just because of my body shape. I've got a big bottom and it needs to do that to fit on the front to get it the shape that I want it. And then the last thing I'm going to do, and I didn't do this when I was making the initial pattern, because if I was adding any fullness or taking anything out of this, changing the length, then it would have changed. But what I need to do is make sure that this doesn't go to a point like this. It just needs to form a nicer curve at the side. So I know I'm adding a little bit of fullness to this, but it's a small amount and it's not going to really affect what I'm doing. So all I'm going to do is just do this by eye to get that a much better shape. You don't want it going down to a point at the side. If you're doing a less A-line shape, if it's quite straight, then you don't really need to worry about this. But the more full you make it, the more that's going to go to a point if you don't correct it. So all I'm doing is just trimming that little bit off. And that's it. When I trace it off now, I've got the right shape for my hem. And when I bring it out, I'll just follow that line along. So this is all ready now to trace off. So let's just zoom out again for a sec. So I'm going to get it all traced off, and then I'll just go through each of these amendments, what I'm doing when I'm tracing it. So I've got this all traced off, so I haven't got to do anything to the neck. I've drawn in the new dart position there, so basically where my red lines are here and the new point, and I've put a couple of little marks here. I've not pressed too hard for this because I'm going to have to rub it all out in a minute, but I've put the 2 marks here where I need to adjust this side seam, and of course I'm not changing this dart here at all. So the first thing I'll do is just finish off this dart. So I just need to find the midpoint here, and I'm just going to draw a point from, this is exactly the same way I did it on the original pattern, but I just need to redo it. So from the end of the dart to that point there, I'm just lining it up and just drawing a line down there. And then the top part of my dart here, I'm just continuing that line down. And then if you remember on this bit here, because of the length of each side, I just need to add 1mm on here. So I'll rub this line out first because it's going to be really hard to rub it out once I've drawn it in. So I'm just extending that very slightly there. And that's the position that I need to join onto there. And this just means that when it folds down, it will all line up. So with my side seam here, this top arrow was the point where I didn't need to change my seam anymore. So I'm just going to join this up now with that new position on the bottom side of the dart. So that joins on there. And then from this point down, so the bottom arrow all the way to the hem, I need to add 7mm on, and that's why I didn't draw in this line here fully, because I knew I was going to be rubbing it out in a second. So at this point here, it needs to be 7mm bigger, and I'm going to just draw that manually all around that hip curve, because I need to follow the curve. And then when I get to the point down here where it straightens off, I can just draw a straight line from that bit there. It was to about this point here. So that bit's nice and easy. I can just join that with a straight line. And I need to just go around all of this bit manually here, doing that 7mm bigger. And then when I've got that basic bit drawn in, all I'm going to do is just turn it like this and use my ruler to draw a much better curve than I can do freehand. So I've now got that curve drawn in there, and then all I need to do is just smooth that out and join that point to that point there. And that's my new side seam position. So now I can rub out the previous line. When I'm doing a finished pattern like this, I always want to rub out anything that I'm no longer using, because if I get this out in a year's time, which I'm likely to do because I use these patterns for a very long time, I don't want to be confused by lines that are no longer relevant. That's the front now completely done. I'm going to add some seam allowance in a second, but what I need to do is exactly the same with the back. The only adjustment I need to do on the back is adjusting the side seam. So I'll get that all traced off, and then I will show you what seam allowance I'm adding on, and we will have a look at the facing that goes around the top. It's hard to get the whole thing in and for you to actually see what's going on because I have to zoom out so far. So let's just concentrate on the top. So I've basically got my front and my back completely traced off, obviously all the way down to the hem. I just can't fit it all in very well. So all I'm going to do is add a 1.5cm seam allowance all around the edge here, all the way down to the hem. And then if I just turn it like this, for my hem I've got 3cm. So I've done that to the edge of the paper here, and then I just need to curve it around this bit here to get my seam allowance on. And once I've drawn all of that on, I can get that cut out. So just looking at the back, I need to have a seam allowance on my centre back. That's where my zip is going to go. And then for my front, this is going to be cut on the fold on the centre front. So no seam allowance there, just the 1.5 all the way around and the 2.5 at the bottom. So I will get all of those seam allowances drawn on, and I can cut these out. And all I need to do as well is I just need to indicate that that's cut on the fold. Just write on here that it is my front and my back. And it's always good just to write what the project is, because if any pieces get muddled up with other projects, you don't want to be confused what's what. And then I always tend to also write on it how much my seam allowance is. Obviously you'll have both lines and you can measure it, but it's just good practice to write on it. So I'll get all of those drawn on and cut out, and then we can have a look at the facing. So that's how it basically looks with the seam allowance on. So I'm going to put this aside, and then what I need to do is I need to draw my facing. So it's just going to come around here, and it saves having a full lining, so it's just a little bit less work, but also sometimes you don't want a lining. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the original pattern that I used, and I'll show you where to draw it and what seam allowance to put on that. So drawing the pieces for the facing is really easy. So all I've done is I've just traced off the very top of both the front and the back. So I can put those pieces aside now. And all I need to do is just draw the shape of the facing here. So I tend to go with about 4 centimetres. You don't have to go with that, and sometimes the neck shape dictates it, because what I'm going to do, I'll draw the 4 centimeters here as well, and then you need to kind of curve this shape. So if you've got a neck that's much higher, it's going to go this kind of shape. If you've got a neck that goes much lower, then your facing is going to go down here. So you need to just kind of work with what shape your facing is. So all I'm going to do is just kind of do a dotted line 4 centimeters around here. So that kind of shows me what shape to do this. And then I'm going to just draw that around like that. And then you basically just need to fill that in. So that's the basic shape, and then I just need to do exactly the same on here. So you'll see by it being a higher neck how different it's going to look. And then I just need to draw that in. What you don't want to do is end up with it being too bulky. So I could have that come a bit rounder there, but what you don't want is it kind of flapping around as you're wearing it. So you just want to have it deep enough that it's not going to pop out of the armhole or the neck, but not so long it's going to bother you on the inside. So that is a pretty good shape. Just make sure, if I just fold this over here like this, just make sure that's a nice straight line as well. So now that I've done that, I just need to add the seam allowances onto this. So at the bottom here, you don't need any seam allowance at all. On your neck edge, you need 1.5 centimeters. On your shoulder, it's the same. On the side seam, it's the same, or whatever seam allowance you've done, but I always tend to stick to 1.5. And then on this armhole bit here, because you want this to stay nicely inside, you don't want to be able to see it, you want to go to about this point here with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. And then the rest of this up here, you want to go slightly smaller. So I'm going to do 1.2 centimeters around this bit here, and it just helps it stay on the inside. Just that 3mm difference is enough to stop your facing poking out, and it's exactly the same idea if you're doing a lining as well. So I'm going to add those seam allowances on here, and I'll do exactly the same on the back. The only difference is I need to add a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance on my centre back, whereas on the centre front here it's on the fold and there's no seam allowance here. So I'll get all of those drawn on and then show you how it looks. So before I cut this out, I just want to show you. So this is the bit here where it's 1.2 centimeters. This is the bit where it's 1.5 centimeters. And then you just kind of need to blend those in. So at this point here, it's 1.2, this point it's 1.5, and this little bit here just goes somewhere in between. You just need to make that a smooth line. When we sew it though, we're going to sew it all with a 1.5 centimeter seam, and you'll see what happens when I come to sew it up. So that's all the pattern pieces now, all finished with the seam allowances, everything you need. So these 2 front pieces need to be cut on the fold, and these 2 pieces, just you need to do mirror images of each of them. Nice and easy to cut out because all the seam allowances are there. So I'm now going to get these cut out of my fabric, and then we can start putting this all together. So now that I've fit my sample, I've done all of these adjustments, I've amended the pattern, and I've made the pattern for my facing, added the seam allowances, all of those things. I'm ready to get my lovely fabric and start cutting out my actual dress. So this is the front cut out on the fold. I just need to mark my darts, and then the facing is on the fold for the front, and 2 identical pieces or mirror image pieces for the back. And then I'll show you what I have done on the back. So I have got a very bold print, and what I don't want is when I put my zip in the centre back, I don't want the pattern to match really badly. So if I just cut these out randomly, I could end up with something like that, which I wouldn't be very happy with at all. And so what I did is I spent a while working out exactly where my seam allowance was and matching it up. And we'll see how well I've done it when I put the zip in, but hopefully my pattern will match perfectly down the back as well. So you'll barely notice that there is a zip and a seam. The first thing I'm going to do to start sewing this up is I'm going to sew all of my darts up. So all I need to do is match all of these up from side to side. I've got 1 on each back piece, and then on my front I've got 1 either side, and then the 2 side darts. So I just need to get all of these pinned together and sewn up, and if you need any help at all sewing up these darts, then there is a link in the description to my separate tutorial on how to sew a perfect dart. So I'm just going to get all of these pinned ready and I'll get them sewn up, and then I'm going to give them all a press as well. And what I do with my darts is on body pieces, I always press them to the side, and on these side darts on the bust, I always press them down. And you'll see where I put this one here, where if you remember on the pattern, I made it this shape. Once that's sewn up and pressed down, then this seam here, help if I folded it right, it all lines up perfectly. So I'm going to get all of these sewn up before I do anything else and press them so they're all finished. So that's all my darts now sewn up. Because I've got such a crazy print, you probably, I imagine, can't even see where they are, but they're all sewn up, pressed to the side, and the side darts here pressed down, and you can see now how that lines up perfectly if you draw it the way I did. So the next thing I'm going to do is just get some overlocking done before I start putting the rest together. So I'm going to overlock down my centre back. I'm going to overlock all the way along the hem. If you've got an overlocker, do this. If you haven't, then whatever finish you're doing on these, I would do these bits now. I'm not going to do anything else on the main pieces, just the centre back and the hem for now. And then on my facing, I'm also going to overlock my centre back, and I'm going to overlock all the way around this curve on all of these pieces. So I'll get that done before I start assembling the dress. I like to get my zip in at the beginning. I just find it easier before doing these side seams to get the zip in the centre back, because you're just working with two flat bits of fabric. Other than the back darts, it's all nice and flat, whereas if you've got it as a finished garment, it just makes it that little bit more fiddly. You don't have to do it in this order, but I just prefer it. So I am using an invisible zip because I want it to be really discreet. I've put a link in the description for a little bit more detail on doing that if you've not done one before, and I've also put a link to my lap zip tutorial, because if you're using a much heavier fabric or something with beads, something like that, that you don't want to use an invisible zip for, and it might be better with a lap zip, I've put a link to a tutorial on that as well. In this tutorial, I don't go into a massive amount of detail on how to put the zip in, because I'm assuming that a lot of people will already know how to do that, and I don't want my video to be too long. So just look at those links if you need a little bit more detail. But what I do show you in this video is how I matched the pattern on my zip, because I didn't want it cutting into the pattern. I wanted it perfectly matched. So I'll show you a little tip on how to do that. So all my darts are pressed. I've got the overlocking done on these particular seams that I said. And the next thing I'm going to do is get my zip in. So I am trying to match this seam up as perfect as I possibly can. So if you're not pattern matching, then you don't need to worry about this. But if you are pattern matching, what you need to think about is getting this perfectly lined up. And what you don't want to do is sew one side of your zip and then sew the other one, and it doesn't match up. If you are doing a lapped zip, then I would say it's slightly easier to match it up maybe, but it's not difficult with an invisible one if you do it right. So what I'm doing first is just pinning this where my seam is going to be, just so I can check that I've actually cut this out right for it to match up. It's not going to sit perfectly flat because of the bobbles on my pins, but I'm pretty happy with that. If you look really closely, there's bits that are off by about a millimetre or two, and that's because sometimes the prints aren't perfectly uniform as they go across. So however good you are, you might not be able to match it up perfectly. But unless you're really looking, the match is pretty good. What I didn't want was something completely mismatched, or for example, these bright yellow flowers then being down here on this one. I wanted it to, at first glance, look perfectly matched. So I know that that's in the right position, which is great. And I now need to put both sides of the zip in to make sure it stays lined up. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to just do a loose kind of basting stitch down here before I start putting my zip in. So you don't have to baste it together to start it, but it just makes the next bit a little bit easier. And actually, doing a big stitch like I have, it really doesn't take very long. It doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. You can see I went off here a little bit because it's all about getting it in the right position vertically. You're not actually working out your seam allowance from this point. So I need to measure where the centre of my zip is from the edge. So it's 1 centimetre from where the teeth join there to the edge, and that means that when I put my zip in, I need 0.5 centimetre from the edge to where the zip tape is, and it's perfect for me. I don't know if all overlock stitches are the same and all zips are the same, but basically I line my zip up with my overlocking stitching. So what I need to do is position it in the correct place at the top. If your zip isn't the right length, make sure you get it the right length, before you start. And then I'm going to mark where the top edge of the finished dress is, which is here. And that dictates to me basically where this is going to go in. So my stopper needs to sit just below there. And then I'm lining that up with the overlocking, how I just said. And I can just pin this in all the way down. So that's the first side now pinned in. And then what I need to do is make sure I get it in exactly the right place on the other side. Because once you take out this row of stitching here, you've got both sides of the zip put in ready. So if I just flip it around like that, I just need to make sure that nothing slips. And if I was using a plain fabric, I wouldn't be doing this. I would just sew both sides of the dress in, and I'd start them from the same position at the top, and I'd know it would all match up, but I'm really particular about my pattern matching. So I want to make sure it's perfect, and I have been known to spend ages on zips to get them absolutely perfect if they've slipped a little bit as I've sewn them in. But because I love really bold prints, what I don't want is my pattern mismatching at the back. I love it when it doesn't even look like I've got a zip or a seam in the back of my dress. So this is why I take my time. And then once you've done this bit, if you are matching a pattern like this, the rest of your dress is lovely and easy. And that's one of the reasons I get the zip out of the way right at the beginning, because once you've got it in, that's it. You haven't got to worry. So I'm just going to carry on pinning that in, and I'm making sure that nothing moves at all as I'm doing it. So once you get that bottom one in there, make sure that all just sits perfectly underneath. You don't want one side slipping up or down. And that is my zip now in. So it won't look any different from the other side because all of that is on the seam allowance. So what I'm going to do before I take out this red row of stitching, I'm going to tack my zip in, and I'm going to go a little bit closer than what my pins are. And the reason I want to go a little bit closer is because it has less chance of then slipping when I sew it up. Just make sure you don't go so close that when you stitch it, you go over your tacking, and then you're going to struggle to get your tacking stitches out. So when you sew it, you want to go really close to the teeth, so just come over a few millimeters. So I won't make you watch me tack this in because it's going to take me a few minutes. So I'll get that tacked in, and then we will take out those basting stitches and see how it looks. That's now tacked in both sides, so it takes a little bit of time, but it should mean that when you come to sew it up, it's really easy. So what I can do now is just take out my stitches that I put in first. I know that it all lines up, so if I just take a few out at the top, you can see now that that's basically where it's going to go. And I know that when I sew it in, it's going to be absolutely perfect. But the other thing I'm going to do is, because this can still slip a little bit, is once I've taken those out, I'm going to undo my zip and I'm going to put a few pins in. I only need to do 2 or 3 down the length before I sew it, because what I don't want to happen is as I sew it, for it just to push a little bit. I am particularly particular about putting these in. So I would just space your pins out like this, and then you can sew it in. But I'll show you that once I've got all of the tacking stitches out from the original seam I put down here. So this is what I mean. Now that it's all undone, I've just spaced these, and it's just one extra little thing that only takes a second to stop it slipping. So I'm going to get this sewn in on both sides now. I'm going to sew nice and close to the teeth so you can't see it when it's zipped up. And if you want any more detail which shows you how to use an invisible zipper foot to do this and how close you need to get, then do have a look at the link I've put in the description, how to sew an invisible zipper in. And as I said, if you're using a lapped zipper, I do have a link for that too. So that's my zip now sewn in. If I'm being really particular, it doesn't quite line up vertically, but I know I am ridiculously particular about things like this. If it was a really bold stripe going across, then I would possibly rejig it. But obviously I've cut these to size, they join up at the top and the bottom, and that's the important thing. If I missed them off by about 1 millimeter when I was cutting them out, then I have to just not worry about it. But as you first glance at this, as I'm wearing it, and I'll obviously be moving, I'm not going to be standing dead still like a statue, you're not going to notice. But the main thing is the flowers line up. I haven't got a flower that's cut into, they don't suddenly jut up and down. It just makes it look a lot more finished. And when you've got darts anyway, you have that little bit of mismatching from those. So it's just part of that. So that is my zip now completely in. I can now take out all of this red tacking. I don't need any of that in there. And I can just finish off this centre back seam down here. So all I need to do is just literally sew up here and then just finish it off at the bottom of the zip. I've got all the details of how to do that, if you're not sure, in my separate tutorials. So I'll get that zip and the centre back seam completely finished off, and I'm going to give it a really good press so I can see completely how this looks finished off. So that's the zip and the centre back seam now completely finished off and pressed, and as I said, it's off by a little bit, so I'm a little bit disappointed, but it's close enough to not really notice. So that's that all now completely finished off, and I now have a complete back and I've got a complete front. So the next stage is to put them together. So just take your time and get that zip in perfectly. Once that's done, I promise the rest of sewing this up is lovely and easy. We just need to put the shoulders and the sides together now before your main panels are a complete dress, and then once we've done that, I'll show you how to get the facing in and finish it off. This really is as straightforward as what I imagine you're expecting. So all I'm doing is I'm just sewing my side seams up. You can do the side seams before you do the zip if you prefer to do it that way, but I always just find putting a zip in when you haven't got a whole garment put together is just so much easier. So all I'm going to do is just pin these together. I'm just making sure they're perfectly lined up at the top and the bottom there, because if you remember, I've got to ease my hip in very slightly, but in a nice soft cotton like this, I doubt I'm even going to notice that I'm doing it, because we're only talking about a tiny amount. So I'm just going to have a look at that now, and you can see that's going to pin together no problem. So all I'm doing is just lining up the edges, pinning that in. And once I've got that side seam completely pinned together, I'm just going to sew this up, and I can finish off the edge with the overlocker, and I'm going to press it to the back. I'll do exactly the same on the other side, and at this stage I'm also going to start assembling my facings. So that is my front piece. I'm going to put my back pieces on, so make sure you get these the right way around. And all I'm going to do is exactly the same as for the main part of the dress. I'm just going to put my side seams together and stitch these and overlock them, and rather than pressing them to the back, I'm going to press them to the front. So it means I've got one seam going in each direction, and it means there'll be less bulk on those armhole seams there. So I'm going to get all these stitched up, overlocked and pressed, and then we can look at what to do next. I always feel really satisfied when it gets to this stage because I can see my dress coming together. So the next thing is just to sew the shoulders, obviously with the right sides facing. So if I just undo my zip, make sure you just get the right shoulder attached to the right shoulder. So right sides together, fold it over like that, and I am going to sew these together. They're going to be contained within the facing, so they don't need any overlocking. So I'm going to get both of those sewn up like that, and I'm going to do exactly the same on my facing. So it gets a bit confusing when you're looking at your facing when it all gets folded over. So all I'm doing is putting the shoulders together, stitching those up, and then for all four of the shoulder seams, I'm just going to press them open. And you'll see when I sew it up why it makes sense to do that. It just distributes the bulk a little bit easier. So I'm just going to sew all of those and press them open. And then we're ready just to put the facing in and do the hem, and then your dress is complete. Now that I've done those shoulder seams, I have a finished dress and a finished facing. I literally need to join them together. So it's your first chance now to try it on now that the zip's in and the sides and shoulders are done. Obviously your neck and armhole aren't finished, so it's not going to look perfect, but it's a great way to see how it looks. I'm always too excited at this stage not to just quickly try it on, but also great to check the fit, because if you are using a different type of fabric to what you did for your sample, it could just fit slightly different. You might find that it feels a little bit looser, might feel a little bit tighter. You can double check all of those things. Just make sure if you haven't stay stitched your neck and armholes that you don't stretch it by trying it on. And the last bit now is to put the facing in. I'll show you first how to join it on the neck and do the understitching, finish off the top of the zip, and how to finish off the armholes. So this is all completely bagged out. There's no extra trims. I think this is the easiest way to sew a neck and armhole to get a really nice neat finish. And if you've not got really skinny straps here, it's actually really easy. If your straps are quite skinny, it is still possible. It'll just be a little bit more fiddly when you get to the top. But this method, once you know how to do it, is lovely and easy. So I'm going to join them together around the neck first and do some understitching, which will help that stay in. And then I'll show you how to really easily bag out your armholes in one go. Well, you'll sew the front and then the back or vice versa, but it's a complete seam around the armhole and you'll get a perfect professional finish. So I'll just show you a step at the time how to get this facing in. If you are using a full lining, then the process is exactly the same. You'll just have two pieces exactly the same, the main dress and the lining, and you will treat this exactly the same. So I've not put any kind of interfacing on my neck. I just don't like the feel of really stiff necklines. So for me, by the time I've got both my facing and my main piece of dress, and then my seam goes under and it's got the understitching, that's enough of an edge for me in this kind of weight fabric. If I used something really lightweight, I might put a really lightweight interfacing in, but I just tend to not add those in, particularly iron ones. I'm just not a fan of them, but that's totally up to you. If you prefer a really crisp, more solid neck, then put your interfacing in. It's not going to make any difference. Just add it to your facing piece before you start sewing it up. The first thing I'm going to do to attach my facing is I'm going to put the right sides together. I'm going to line it up at the shoulders and at the centre back, and I'm going to get that stitched on. So the easiest way to make sure this is perfect is to just stick a pin through both shoulder seams so that they're perfectly lined up. And on the back, I'm just opening up the zip, lining these up, but I'm not going to sew all the way to the back. I'm only going to sew to about 1.5 centimetres from where the zip teeth are. And you'll see why when I finish off this facing in a minute. So about that distance. So all I need to do is just pin this on all the way around. So I'll do exactly the same on the other side of the back and pin it around the front as well, and then I can just get this stitched on at my 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. That's all now pinned on, so all I need to do is just sew from this point here that's 1.5 centimetres roughly from where the zip teeth are all the way around to the other side, and you'll just have this little bit either side that's not stitched down. I've got that all now sewn on, so before you do anything else, just make sure you haven't got anything caught up when you put it on. And the next thing I'm going to do is some understitching to make sure this facing stays on the inside. So I will be finishing this off in a second, so ignore this, but basically that is going to sit nicely on the inside of the zip when I finish this off. But I'm going to do the understitching first. So where you've sewn to there, you want to do the understitching to about 1.5 centimetres again from that point. And I'm just going to sew just to the right of the seam, and I need to go through this seam allowance. So you need to make sure your seam allowance is facing this way, your facing sits over it, and you sew through all of that. And I'm just going to sew from one side to the other about 1.5 centimetres from where I've stitched it on. So this is where I need to sew it. Basically, I've got my seam allowance. Let's make sure I've got all this in shot. My seam allowance is going to the right here. My facing then sits over that and just down from where I've sewn this on. So about this point here, I just need to sew this. If I line this part of my foot up with the seam, then it's the perfect kind of position. So I just need to sew at this point here all the way around. So it's literally just a couple of millimetres over from this seam. So I will attempt to sew this while I'm filming it and try not to knock it. But this is basically what I need to do all the way around. And the whole purpose is to help this stay nicely on the inside, because you don't want to see your facing or your lining from the outside on your finished dress. Once you've got that understitching done, you can trim off this seam allowance here. So if you weren't to trim it, it's not going to sit very nicely going around that curve, particularly where it goes from front to back on the shoulder here. It needs a good trim. So all I'm going to do, I'm not touching the zip, and I'm going to just trim from this point here where I've started and finished the understitching at the back, and I'm just going to leave about 0.5 centimetre from where it's been stitched. And then when I turn it the right way around, I will see if I've trimmed this enough for it to sit nice and flat. So I'm just going to get that all trimmed off, and then I can just finish the facing around the zip, and that's the neck edge done, and all we've got left to do are the armholes. So now that I've trimmed this nice and short, when I flip it to the inside, you can see when it goes around those curves, it already sits really nicely, and once it's had a press, that's going to sit really well. So the next thing I want to do is just finish this all off at the centre back, which is a lot easier than you might expect. If you've done a lapped zip rather than an invisible zip, then do have a look at my lapped zip tutorial to see how this is finished off. It's pretty much the same, but it's just very slightly different. But if you're doing an invisible zip like me, what you need to do is put those right sides together, and with your facing underneath, you need it to stick out from underneath here, 1/2 centimetre. So for me, that's the width of my overlocking. So I'm just gonna pin that there, and all I need to do is I need to stitch down here. I need to stitch reasonably close to my zip tee, so I'll just put the zip foot on and stitch down here to go through both layers, and I'll do that on both sides. So what I've done is, as I said, put the zip foot on so I can get nice and close, and this is about the distance I need to sew. So you can see the stitch line here is where I sewed the zip on, really close to the teeth. So I don't want to go too close to that because I don't want my facing getting caught in the zip. But I basically just need to stitch down here to the point where the facing finishes, and then finish that off at the bottom. And if you've got a full lining, your lining will just carry on all the way down. So you just need to stitch the whole way down. So once that is sewn on, when you flip this around, you'll see now that the facing, because of that overlap, it sits nicely on the inside, so you're not going to see that at all on the outside. The last bit to do is just to finish this little corner here, and because of the way that I've had the facing sticking out a little bit further, it means that that will really easily lay flat like this. So if I just put a pin there to hold that in place, you'll see that all I need to do is continue this stitch line all the way across the top. So just pull that down so you can find the bit where you stitched it on where there's no understitching, and just continue this line across at the same seam allowance. And if you've put your zip in at the right height, that will sit just above the zip stopper, and then you can just trim that off and turn it the right way round. Once it's all trimmed and turned the right way round, this is how it looks. So make sure yours lines up at the top, and that's how it looks on the inside. Still needs a little bit of a press, but that is how nice and neat that will look when it's finished. And I could just put a hook and eye at the top as well to hold that together. So that is the neck now finished, and I need to move on to the armholes. That I would say are even easier. So I will show you on one and then do the other one. And what I will say is the wider the strap, the easier this process is. When the strap gets quite skinny, it is a little bit fiddlier. It's not impossible. I've done this process with straps that are really, really skinny. It's just fiddly. But with a nice wide strap like this, you won't have any problems at all. So I'll start at the armhole. So if I show you from this side, that's where the seam allowance turns under there, and it turns under there. And these 2 points join up where that side seam is. So the easiest way to make sure you don't accidentally get this twisted is to do that and then just go to the inside and grab those 2 pieces together, and then just stick a pin through the seam on one of them, doesn't matter which way around you do this, and then stick it through the other one. And if you remember when we made the pattern, we cut the facing with a smaller seam allowance. We're not sewing it with a smaller seam allowance. We're going to use the same seam allowance as the outside, but because the inside was cut a little bit smaller, that's what's going to enable it to sit completely on the inside of your dress. So let's go to the inside now, and all I'm going to do is just pin around here, and I can then sew that on. So depending on how wide your shoulders are, you can either do this all in one go, or you might have to do the front or back and then turn it around and do the other side. It all comes down to the strap width, how bulky your fabric is, and how fiddly you are happy to do this. So I'm just going to get this pinned, and I'm going to see if I can do this all in one go, or if I'm going to need to do one half and then the other. I've got one side pinned and it's going to be too fiddly with the strap size that I've got to turn this around and do it all in one go. So all I'm going to do is sew from the armhole up to this shoulder seam where my 1.5 seam allowance is, and then I'm going to trim this off and then turn it around and do the other side. So that's the first side sewn up. Make sure you haven't got any of the fabric from your dress caught in this before you start trimming it. And then all I need to do is just trim my seam allowance a little bit. Don't go too short, you don't want to weaken it. We're not doing understitching on here because it's kind of fiddly to do, and you don't really need to do it on the armhole so much. You could do a little bit at the bottom if you want to, but you won't be able to get up into that strap very easily. So let's turn that around and see how it looks. So that is the first half of that armhole done. And now all I need to do is just go up the other side. I've obviously already got the armhole and the shoulder bit in place anyway from when I sewed the first half. So I just need to do exactly the same process up this side and give it a trim, and that's that first armhole finished. And then I'll just do exactly the same with the other armhole. So I'm going to get that all done and I'll show you how it looks when everything has been sewn, trimmed and pressed on both armholes. And that's how it looks once it's all pressed. So I've got lovely, neat armholes and neck. Everything is sitting nicely on the inside. So if I hold it up here, hopefully you can see. You can just see a slight hint of the outside on either side, which shows that that inside is slightly smaller, and that's what's keeping it from being seen on the outside. So that's that all now done. One other little thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to stitch these down on my side seams because I don't want those coming out when I'm wearing it. So I'm literally just going to do a little stitch through the facing and through this seam here. And then the very last thing is to do my hem. I'm just going to hand sew my hem up. Just keep it nice and simple so it's not seen from the outside. You can do whichever hem you like. A lot of that comes down to what kind of fabric you might have used. If you need any help doing your hem, then there is a link to my separate tutorial that shows you all different types of hem, both done by hand and various machines. So that's that now done, and I finally get to put this on and wear it. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you have, then do please subscribe, like and share my tutorial, as it helps me to grow my channel. I upload new tutorials every week, and if there's any tutorial you'd love to see that I haven't done yet, do please ask in the comments, because it's when people ask me different tutorials to do that it gives me great ideas of things that I haven't already thought of.